The first time Isabella Hart stood before Duke Alexander Whitmore, she did not bow. Not because she lacked respect, but because grief had taught her something pride never could. When you've already buried the love of your life, no title on earth can make you tremble. Rain clung to her black veil as she stood in the vast marble hall of Whitmore Estate, water pooling quietly at her feet. Chandeliers glowed overhead like indifferent stars, casting light on walls that had never known hunger, never known loss. Yet here she was, a widow with empty hands and a heart that still whispered her husband's name in the dark. She had come to refuse him. And somehow, she would leave as his wife. Alexander Whitmore, Duke of Ravenshollow, was dying. Not publicly, no, the world still saw him as the unshakable pillar of nobility. A man carved from discipline and expectation. But beneath the tailored coats and commanding gaze was a body betraying him, one breath at a time. His illness had a cruel condition. Without marriage, the estate would pass to his ruthless cousin, a man known for turning tenant families into beggars overnight. Doctors had been clear. Stress would kill him faster than the sickness. And time was a luxury Alexander no longer possessed. That was why he had summoned Isabella. She was the only woman in the room who did not want him. Mrs. Hart, he said, his voice steady despite the pain clawing his chest. Thank you for coming. She met his gaze, sharp, intelligent, wounded. I came because your letter mentioned my late husband. The word late struck like a blade. Alexander exhaled slowly. Thomas Hart saved my life in the war. I owed him a debt I never repaid. Isabella's fingers tightened beneath her gloves. Debts are not repaid by summoning widows. No, he said quietly. They are repaid by telling the truth. Silence swelled between them. Then, with a dignity that cost him everything, the Duke did the unthinkable. He stepped down from the dais. And knelt. Gasps echoed from the servants lining the walls, but Isabella could not breathe. Please, Alexander whispered. Pretend to be my wife, or I will die. Her heart slammed against her ribs. You don't mean that, she said, voice shaking. I do, he replied. And I would not beg if there were another way. He explained everything then, the illness, the inheritance law, the cousin waiting like a vulture. He spoke not of himself, but of the hundreds who lived on Whitmore land. The children who would starve. The elderly who would be thrown from their homes. I need a marriage of appearance, he said. 1 year. No touch, no obligation beyond public presence. After that, I will ensure you are cared for the rest of your life. Isabella laughed softly, bitterly. You want to buy my grief? No, he said. I want to borrow your strength. That was when she saw it, not a duke, not a powerful man. But a human being, terrified of dying without having protected those who depended on him. Her husband Thomas had been the same. Always choosing others. Always believing kindness mattered. She turned toward the window, rain streaking down the glass like tears the sky could not hold. I loved my husband, she said. With everything I had. I know, Alexander replied. That is why I chose you. She faced him again. If I do this, it will be a lie. Yes, he admitted. But sometimes lies save lives. The wedding was announced within days. The country erupted. A grieving widow marrying the most powerful duke in the region? Whispers followed her like shadows. Some called her a fortune hunter. Others a traitor to her late husband's memory. None of them saw the way she trembled on the altar. None of them noticed how Alexander kept his distance, as promised. Their marriage was cold, formal, flawless in public, and achingly lonely in private. Isabella moved through the estate like a guest in her own life. She wore silk gowns and slept in a separate wing. Every night, she spoke to Thomas in her prayers, begging forgiveness for the role she was playing. Yet slowly, things changed. Alexander listened when she spoke. Really listened. When she suggested lower rents during winter, he agreed without question. When she asked to reopen the closed schoolhouse, he funded it himself. When servants fell ill, he ordered doctors immediately. You don't have to do that, she told him once. I do, he said simply. You remind me why I should. And when his health worsened, When pain bent him double and pride could no longer hide it, Isabella stayed. She sat beside his bed, reading aloud when he could not sleep. Still no touch. Still allie. But something real was growing in the silence between words. One night, during a storm much like the one the day they met, Alexander whispered, "If I survive this year, I will release you." Her chest ached. "And if you don't?" she asked. He looked at her then, not as a duke, not as a patient, but as a man who had fallen in love without permission. "Then I will die grateful," he said. "Because you gave my life meaning at the end." Isabella realized, with a quiet terror, that the lie was no longer the most dangerous thing between them. It was the truth. Isabella did not answer him right away. Love, spoken aloud, had weight. It pressed against her chest, stirred memories she had buried carefully beneath duty and survival. For months she had told herself that what bound her to Alexander was compassion, nothing more. That kindness could exist without desire. That loyalty did not require love. But now the word stood between them, undeniable and alive. "I can't," she said at last, her voice barely more than a breath. Alexander nodded slowly, as if he had expected the refusal. "I know." "You don't," she continued, pain sharpening her tone. "You don't know what it costs to love again after you've buried someone. Every feeling feels like betrayal. Every smile feels stolen." He looked at her then, not wounded, not defensive, but understanding. "I would never ask you to replace him." "That's the problem," she whispered. "You're not asking. You're just becoming." Outside the estate, the world tightened its grip. The crown announced an inquiry. Officials arrived with ledgers and cold smiles, their questions polite but predatory. Servants were interviewed. Accounts examined. Every gesture between Isabella and Alexander was measured for authenticity. The lie that had saved a life was now threatening to end many. Alexander's cousin, Lord Benedict Whitmore, arrived days later, elegant, amused, and cruelly patient. "You look thinner," Benedict remarked, surveying Alexander like damaged property. "Illness does that, I suppose." Isabella felt Alexander stiffen beside her. Benedict turned his gaze to her. "And you must be the widow." Remarkable how grief can be persuaded. That night, Isabella could not sleep. She walked the halls until she reached the small chapel tucked away in the east wing. It smelled of old wood and candle wax, of prayers whispered by people who had nowhere else to turn. She knelt. "I don't know what's right anymore," she murmured into the silence. "I only know what feels human." The next morning, she made a decision that would change everything. When the Crown's officials reconvened, Isabella asked to speak. Gasps followed her as she stepped forward, hands steady, heart racing. "My marriage began as a pretense," she said clearly. Alexander turned to her, horror flashing across his face. "Isabella." "But it did not remain one," she continued, cutting through the room like a blade through silk. "I was asked to protect a dying man and the lives bound to his name. He agreed. Not for money. Not for title. But because kindness demanded it." Benedict smiled triumphantly. "Until she finished. I shared his home. He witnessed his suffering. He saw a man who used his last strength to ensure others would not starve. And somewhere between the lie and the truth, he chose to stay." She met Alexander's eyes. "Not because I was asked. But because I love him." The room fell silent. The officials exchanged looks, uncertain, shaken. Benedict's smile faltered. Alexander struggled to his feet. "I never intended." Isabella reached for his hand. "This time," she did not let go. "If the Crown wishes to punish deception," she said, "then punish me. But do not mistake compassion for fraud." The inquiry was suspended. Temporarily. But Alexander collapsed that evening. The doctors were grim. His heart was failing. Days, perhaps weeks. Isabella refused to leave his side. She read to him, held him, whispered stories of a future they might never have. And for the first time, they shared a bed. Not out of necessity, not out of deception, but out of quiet, aching love. One night, as rain battered the windows, Alexander stirred weakly. "You should go," he whispered. "Before this ends with you alone." She pressed her forehead to his. "I was already alone." "You changed that." Tears slipped down his temples. "I never thought I would be loved," he said. "Not like this." She kissed his hand. "Neither did I." Outside the estate, pressure mounted. The crown demanded a final ruling. Benedict prepared to claim everything. And Isabella realized something terrifying and beautiful. Love had made her brave. If Alexander died, she would fight. Not for land. Not for title. But for the truth that kindness, even when born from a lie, could change the world. The bells of Ravens Hollow rang at dawn, slow and heavy, their sound rolling across the hills like a warning. Alexander was still alive. Barely. Isabella sat beside his bed, counting his breaths the way one counts seconds before a storm breaks, afraid that if she stopped, the world would collapse into silence. His skin was cool now, the fever replaced by a fragile calm that frightened her more than the worst nights had. The physician stood near the door, hat in hand. "He may not last the day," he said gently. Isabella nodded. She had known. Her heart had known long before her mind allowed it. "Please," Alexander murmured, his eyes fluttering open. "Help me sit." She slid an arm behind him, lifting him carefully. The effort left him breathless, but his gaze sharpened with purpose. "I need you to promise me something," he said. She swallowed. "Anything. When I'm done, don't let them turn this place into something cruel." Her voice broke. "You won't be gone." He smiled faintly. "You always were a terrible liar." Outside, carriages lined the drive. The crown had arrived. The inquiry resumed that morning in the great hall, transformed into a courtroom heavy with expectation. Nobles filled the benches, their faces polished with curiosity. Lord Benedict Whitmore stood confidently at the front, certain history was about to bend in his favor. Isabella entered alone. Murmurs followed her, some sympathetic, others sharp with judgment. The presiding magistrate spoke. "Duchess of Ravens Hollow, the Duke is unable to attend. We regret." "I speak for him," Isabella said calmly. "As his wife." Benedict scoffed. "A wife by convenience." She turned toward him, eyes steady. "A husband by courage." The magistrate raised a hand for silence. "Proceed." Isabella told the truth, all of it. She spoke of the night Alexander knelt before her. Of the illness. Of the law that punished honesty and rewarded cruelty. She spoke of the children who now attended school again, of the tenants who survived winter because rents were lowered, of a man who used his final strength not to save himself, but others. "I began this marriage as an act of mercy," she said. "I stayed because love arrived quietly, without permission." Benedict stepped forward. "Love does not change the law." "No," Isabella replied. "But it reveals its flaws." The magistrate leaned back, thoughtful. "And what do you ask of the crown?" She took a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff. "Let the estate remain as it is. Under my stewardship. Not because I am his wife, but because I am willing to serve." Gasps rippled through the hall. Benedict laughed. A widow playing duchess. Isabella met his gasp. A human being choosing responsibility. A messenger burst into the hall, breathless. "The Duke," he said, "is asking for her." Everything stopped. Isabella ran. Alexander was fading fast when she reached him. The room smelled of candles and final prayers. He smiled when he saw her, weak but present. "Did you fight?" he whispered. "Yes," she said, tears spilling freely now. "I told them everything." "Good," he murmured. "Then I can rest." She took his face in her hands. "They haven't ruled yet." He shook his head slightly. "They will." "Alexander." "Thank you," he said softly. "For loving me, even when it began as a lie." She pressed her forehead to his. "It was never a lie to me." His breath slowed. Then stopped. Isabella stayed there long after the world went quiet, holding the man who had changed her life not by demanding love, but by earning it. 3 days later, the crown announced its decision. The estate of Ravens Hollow would remain intact. Isabella Hart, widow, Duchess, Guardian, was named its lawful steward. Lord Benedict was stripped of claim and title. The ruling cited an unusual reason. In matters where the law fails humanity, compassion may serve as precedent. Years passed. Ravenshollow flourished. Isabella never remarried, yet she was never alone. She walked the land Alexander loved, greeted by children whose futures had been preserved by a man who refused to die quietly. In the chapel, a small plaque rested beneath the window. Love does not always begin in truth. But when it chooses to stay, it becomes something greater than law. And every time the bells rang across the hills, they no longer sounded like warning,